The world inside Maverick Williams' home had always been quiet, a soft kind of quiet, the kind that hummed through the worn floorboards and settled gently in the garden, where rows of violet blossoms swayed under the late autumn wind. For 3 decades, this house had been his anchor. He had built its porch with his own hands, painted its shutters blue because Grace had loved how they caught the light. 6 years had passed since Grace's laughter last touched these walls. In those years, the silence had deepened, but it was a silence Mave had made peace with because for the first time in his life, after her passing, he had found the courage to live as who he truly was. He was gay, and he was no longer hiding. That morning, the quiet shattered. Dawn stood in the middle of the living room, her arms folded, her voice clipped like the snap of a door. Dave, her husband, loomed beside her in a tailored suit, his smile stretched tight. "Dad, this isn't safe anymore," Dawn said. Though her eyes avoided his, Dave spoke for her, his words laced with something colder. "You're living alone. You're unstable. This place isn't suited for someone like you. Someone like you." The phrase hung in the air like a stain. They laid out papers on the coffee table as if it were already theirs. Legal forms, signatures, a plan to have him declared legally incapable. "We've found a place," Dave said smoothly. "A retirement center. Quiet, supervised, safer for everyone." Dawn nodded. Mechanical. She spoke of safety, care, and responsibility as though reading lines rehearsed too many times. Dave leaned closer, his tone sharp enough to cut, "You can't keep up this eccentric lifestyle. It's time to do the responsible thing." The word eccentric dug into Mave's skin like a blade. He knew what Dave meant. Not just old, not just alone, but gay, as if being true to himself disqualified him from dignity. Mave's hands trembled, though he kept them hidden in his lap. He looked past them to the photograph on the mantel. Grace, smiling in a wide-brimmed hat, holding a pot of violets. She had known this truth about him long before he dared say it aloud. She had held him the night he came out, whispered that love was not something shameful, that no piece of him needed hiding. She had been the first and only person who never asked him to pretend. Now their daughter was asking him to vanish from his own life. Dave pressed a pen into his palm. "Sign, and this will all be easier." Dawn turned away when he searched her face for mercy. She did not meet his eyes. That night, the house sat in eerie stillness, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Grace once called too loud but too honest. Mave moved through the rooms like a ghost, fingers grazing the grooves in the kitchen table, the worn banister, the door frame where Dawn's childhood height marks still lingered. He reached the study and stopped. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish. In the corner sat Grace's old oak desk. He hadn't opened it in years. Its surface was smooth, untouched, but the bottom drawer resisted when he pulled. Something inside was locked away. A slim folder, bound with a delicate brass clasp, tucked so far back he almost missed it. Dust clung to its edges like a secret. His heart pounded as he lifted it into the lamplight. It was heavier than it looked. Whatever lay inside, Grace had meant for him to find it someday. And tonight, with everything crumbling around him, someday had finally come. If you believe respect can save a family, comment, respect, and share the story. Follow Heart Stories for the next part of Mave's journey. The folder felt like it pulsed in Maverick Williams' hands, as if it carried the echo of Grace's heartbeat. He carried it to the kitchen table, the same one where they had eaten countless quiet breakfasts, where she once braided Dawn's hair before school. The brass clasp snapped open with a hesitant click, and the room seemed to exhale. Inside lay neatly stacked documents, their edges still crisp despite the years, and atop them, an envelope marked only with his name in Grace's familiar looping script. His chest tightened. He unfolded the letter slowly, as if the paper might dissolve under his fingers. Grace's handwriting drifted across the page like a soft voice returning from the other side. "If you are reading this, love, it means I am gone, and you are still standing. You always were stronger than you believed. All that I have is yours, every account, every share, every acre. They may only inherit if they honor you, if they care for you with respect and love. Please use what I've built not to punish, but to protect. And promise me something. Mave, live the rest of your days as yourself, not as anyone's secret. Beneath her words lay a small enamel pin shaped like a rainbow, the one she had slipped into his palm on a rainy afternoon decades ago, when they stood at the edge of a P-flag meeting, helping other parents learn how to love their children exactly as they were. It was the only time he had seen her cry, not from sadness, but from the hope that someday he might stop hiding. He traced the pin as if it were still warm from her touch. Beneath the letter were legal documents he had never seen, a will transferring to him not just the house but an entire web of quiet investments Grace had tended in secret. There were share certificates from the very company where Dave worked, the deed to the downtown apartment building where Dawn and Dave now lived, a plot of untouched land on the city's edge, and accounts that automatically funneled rent into a trust under his name. Grace had built a quiet empire beneath their lives, and she had done it for him. The weight of it staggered him, not because of the wealth, but because of the intention. She had foreseen the storm. She had known what their ambition might become when mixed with contempt, and she had planted this shield long before the battle ever began. At dawn on Monday, while frost still crusted the garden, the sound of engines cut through the cold air. Mave opens the door to find a moving crew in the driveway, truck doors yawning open, men hoisting dollies toward his steps. Behind them stood John and Dave, faces set in brittle resolve. Mave stepped onto the porch, spine straight though his joints ached. He held up the deeds with the steady authority of someone who finally remembered his worth. "This property," he said, his voice calm enough to still the crew's motion, "is not yours to clear out." He handed the foreman a copy of the title bearing his name. Confusion rippled through the men. Dave's mask cracked. He hissed that Dawn was pregnant, that stress could harm the baby, that surely Mave wouldn't want to bring harm to his own grandchild. His words slithered with urgency, but beneath them trembled fear. Dawn said nothing, her gaze fixed on the violets curling in the frost. Mave looked at her, then at the papers, and shook his head. He would not trade his dignity for peace built on coercion. By sunset, Dave had filed a petition in court, accusing Mave of financial manipulation, of fracturing the family, of being mentally unfit to remain in control of assets. He demanded the right to act as guardian for their unborn child's future. As the cold deepened that night, Mave sat alone under the yellow lamplight, the rainbow pin resting on his palm. Grace had asked him to protect, not to punish, and he would, because sometimes defending love meant standing unshaken, even when the people you love try to erase you. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of air that seemed to press down like judgment itself. Maverick Williams sat on the cold bench outside the chamber doors, the folder of evidence resting on his knees. He had dressed carefully that morning, pressing the creases from his jacket until the fabric obeyed, not out of vanity but to remind himself he was still the man Grace had believed in. His fingers hovered over the rainbow pin on his lapel, a small flash of color against the gray. It anchored him, beside him. Victoria adjusted her glasses, her voice quiet but firm as she reviewed their plan once more. She had been methodical in her preparation, gathering fragments of truth from every corner of his life text messages, where Dave called him a disgrace, recordings of Dave threatening to have him declared incompetent, statements from neighbors who had overheard the shouting, who had seen Dave's menacing visits at odd hours. Victoria had understood what few others did. This case was not just about property. It was about dignity and the right to exist without fear. In the weeks leading up to this day, she had also uncovered something even Mave had almost forgotten. Decades earlier, when he was still living as Grace's quiet husband, he had spent evenings volunteering at the St. Jude LGBTQ Youth Center. Back then, he never told anyone his truth. He simply showed up, repairing leaky sinks, refilling snack jars, leaving small kindnesses in places no one noticed. Those children had been mirrors of the Pema he once was afraid. Unseen, waiting for permission to become real. He had never imagined those quiet nights would matter now. The bailiff called his name, and the door opened. The courtroom loomed larger than he expected, sunlight slanting through tall windows onto polished floors. Dawn sat at the petitioner's table, her shoulders tense, eyes darting anywhere but toward him. Dave lounged beside her with the oily confidence of someone certain the world bends his way. When the judge entered, the room rose, and then it stopped. The judge froze mid-step. His eyes caught on Mave and stayed there, wide with something almost disbelieving. A flicker of recognition passed like lightning through his expression before he masked it with composure and took his seat. "This court is now in session," he said, but his voice wavered for just an instant. Mave's pulse hammered. He did not understand until the judge spoke his name, Miss Williams. "It has been a long time." It struck like a bell. David Morales. The name printed on the placard before him was the same as the nervous intern who had once lingered after every meeting at St. Jude, terrified someone would discover he was gay. Back then, Mave had offered him nothing but warmth, a spare sandwich, a letter of recommendation, a quiet assurance that living in truth was not the same as living in shame. Dave leapt to his feet, shouting about conflict of interest, about bias, about impropriety. Morales raised a hand and silenced him with a look. "This court will hear evidence," he said evenly, "not prejudice." Victoria rose and laid their case bare. She played the recordings where Dave threatened to strip Mave's legal rights, projected the text dripping with contempt, submitted statements from neighbors who had heard him raging in the driveway about getting rid of the old man. She showed the power of attorney documents Dave had prepared without Mave's consent, listing unstable behavior and sexual deviation as justifications. The words landed like stones in the silent chamber. Dave flailed, painting Mave as manipulative, accusing him of hoarding wealth despite his family, insisting the unborn child's future was at risk. But every argument unraveled under the weight of evidence. Dawn said nothing, only watched her husband's voice crack like thin glass. When Morales delivered his ruling, his tone was clear and cold. The petition was denied in full. Dave's claims were declared baseless. An order of protection barred him from approaching Mave or the property. Morales added a final note, his eyes cutting through Dave's protests. "This court will not allow prejudice to masquerade as concern." Relief did not flood Mave. It arrived slowly like thawing ice. The house was safe, but something deeper had been defended, the truth of who he was, and his right to stand on his own ground without apology. That evening, as the courtroom emptied, Dawn lingered near the doorway. Her voice was barely more than breath. She asked if she could stay at the house for a night, to try to mend what she had helped break. Mave looked at her, the child he once rocked to sleep, and said quietly that forgiveness would take time and respect. Sometimes dignity is not given. It is reclaimed piece by choosing not to disappear, even when those you love would rather you fade. The house no longer felt like a fortress under siege. The air had softened, like the first mild day after a brutal winter. Dawn moved through the rooms with hesitant steps, as if every creak of the floorboards carried the weight of her shame. She had left Dave the week after the hearing. The announcement had come in a clipped email Victoria forwarded to Mave's separation in progress, but the truth of it showed in her eyes when she appeared on the porch again. There was no jewelry on her fingers now, no fire in her tone, just a quiet determination that seemed foreign and fragile at once. She began therapy, she said, and this time it wasn't to prove anything to anyone. It was to untangle the years of fear and pride she had mistaken for love. She spoke haltingly of how Dave had taught her to view vulnerability as weakness, how she had believed control could keep her safe. She confessed the moment she first learned about her father's sexuality, not from him, but from whispers Dave had twisted into poison, and how she had let that knowledge become a weapon rather than a bridge. Mave listened, not with eagerness, but with the stillness of someone who had waited years for honesty without daring to hope for it. One afternoon, she brought down from the attic the small, lacquered box of Grace's jewelry. The gold had dulled, but the pieces still shimmered faintly in the sunlight that slanted across the kitchen counter. She placed it gently before Mave. "I think she meant for these to stay with you," she said. He traced the delicate chain of Grace's favorite locket, the one that had once held a photo of Dawn as a toddler. There was no triumph in his eyes, only sorrow touched by something warmer. They decided together that the box would remain in the study, on the shelf above the desk where Grace had kept her papers, as if returning it could stitch a small tear in the fabric of their family. They began to move through the days, almost like gardeners tending new soil. Dawn followed him into the yard in the cool mornings, crouching beside the violet beds that had wilted during the months of turmoil. Her hands were clumsy at first, nails cracking as she dug, but she stayed. They pruned the dead stems, turned the soil, pressed new seedlings into the earth. When they finished, Dawn fetched a small pride flag and tucked it into the soil by the porch steps. It fluttered gently in the breeze, subtle but steady, like a pulse. Mave said nothing, only adjusted its angle until it faced the sun. But healing did not mean forgetting the danger that had stalked them. One gray morning, the sharp echo of fists on the door cut through the calm. Dave stood on the front walk, rage clinging to him like static. He demanded to see Dawn, demanded to negotiate, his voice slick with the false authority he wore like cologne. Victoria answered from the intercom by the gate. Her tone was crisp steel as she reminded him the property was legally secured in Mave's name and that the protection order remained in force. When he refused to leave, the security guard on duty approached, firm but courteous, and guided him off the premises. Dawn watched from the upstairs window, her shoulders trembling, but her feet rooted. In the days after, Mave's resolve hardened into something larger than defense. He began drafting plans for a foundation, a sanctuary for those who had no one left to stand up for them. He called it Home and Dignity. The mission was simple: to provide housing support and legal guidance for older women and LGBTQ seniors who had been cast aside by their families, just as he nearly had been. It was not born from a vengeance, but from the quiet conviction Grace had left in her letter: use what you have to protect, not punish. At the launch gathering, he stood beneath the warm glow of cafe lights strung across the community hall. Around him were faces lined with age and endurance, some etched with cautious hope. He spoke not of his ordeal, but of what he had learned: that living openly had cost him the illusion of harmony, but had given him back his soul. Being honest about who you are, he said, will never destroy a family. Only prejudice can do that. Letters began arriving in the weeks that followed, handwritten notes from gray-haired men who had slept in cars, from women who had hidden their true selves through entire marriages, from people who had finally secured small apartments and legal documents with the foundation's help. Each envelope felt like a heartbeat returned to the world. In helping strangers reclaim their safety, Mave realized something quiet and profound. Home was never the wood and plaster of walls. It was the place where truth was allowed to breathe. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly living inside one. The third facility of the Home and Dignity Foundation opened beneath a sky the color of clean linen, sunlight spilling over the fresh white brick. Banners rippled in the breeze, their edges snapping softly above the crowd gathered on the lawn. Reporters clustered near the podium, pens poised, while former residents of the program milled about in quiet awe, some clutching manila folders of their new lease agreements like passports to another life. Maverick Williams stood off to the side, hands folded over the head of his cane, the rainbow pin on his lapel catching the light. The garden smelled faintly of violets, freshly planted along the walkway just that morning. It still felt unreal that Grace's careful planning had bloomed into this. Her investments had been sold and reshaped into living space, community clinics, legal resource centers. Mave had thought it would be enough simply to keep the wolves from his door. Instead, he had found himself building doors for others who had nowhere left to knock. When the MC announced Judge David Morales, the applause swelled. Morales walked to the microphone with his usual composed gravity. But when he reached the stand, he paused. A stillness fell over the crowd. He did not look at his notes. Instead, he held up a worn plastic badge threaded through a faded blue lanyard. "This," he said, "is my St. Jude volunteer card, dated 1995. I was 19. I was terrified, and I was sleeping in my car." His gaze swept the audience and landed on Mave. "There was one man who didn't ask me to explain myself or justify my existence. He gave me dinner. He wrote me a recommendation letter so I could get a real job. He gave me a couch to sleep on until I could stand up on my own feet. That man is standing here today, and because of him, thousands more will stand tomorrow." The applause rose again, but softer this time, like something reverent. Then Morales smiled faintly, as though unveiling the truest secret of the day. "And there is one more thing. These walls you see behind me, the land they stand on, were purchased by an anonymous donor. That donor wished to remain unnamed until today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. From the side of the stage, Dawn stepped forward. Her hair was pulled back simply, her hands steady even as her eyes glimmered. "I sold the last of what I inherited," she said, her voice clear though it trembled at the edges. "Not because I owed it, because I wanted to build something worthy of the people who raised me, of the man who taught me what strength really is, and of the woman who never let love be small." She lifted a plaque wrapped in white cloth, then drew the fabric away. The letters gleamed in brass, "The Grace Home for Dignity and Second Chances." A hush swept the crowd before it broke into applause that sounded like rainfall on stone. Mave's throat tightened as Dawn crossed to him, placing the plaque in his hands as though offering back something she had once stolen. Behind her, Serenity toddled across the grass, clutching a safety pin. She stopped at his feet, stretched on tiptoe, and fixed the rainbow pin back onto his jacket where it had slipped loose. "For you, Grandpa," she whispered. The tiny gesture struck harder than any court ruling ever could. Dawn met his gaze, tears bright but unfallen. "I'm sorry," she said, not like a plea but like a promise. "My child will grow up in a home where no one has to earn love by being someone they're not." The three of them stood together in the courtyard while the new residents drifted toward the doors, shoulders unburdened, carrying their futures in their hands. For the first time, the house behind him did not feel like armor. It felt like legacy. Because Grace had been right. Money could defend dignity, but only love and integrity could rebuild a home. And when prejudice was finally stripped away, families could learn how to love each other all over again. Would you forgive someone if they returned not with excuses, but with change? Comment respect. If you believe love can rebuild what prejudice once broke, and follow Heart Stories for more stories like this.